Yeah, because from the Japanese point of view, this is a lightning strike going down Malaya. They are trying to go as quickly as they can to cut off as many men before they reach Singapore. So, yeah, they're not taking prisoners. At least not
And
prisoners that are wounded.
yeah, and you also have to pull back some of your forces to guard them.
Yeah.
And it's also a logistical strain.
Yeah, of course. Afterwards, the surviving prisoners were forced to dig graves for the men that were murdered, and they would carry the wounded Japanese soldiers as they continued. So you can imagine swallowing that pill. Primrose had to carry a Japanese officer he had shot twice. The man died before he could reveal his assailant, however. The column of tanks, trucks, infantry, and prisoners were marching their way towards the Slim
That was
River.
very good for that lieutenant.
Oh yeah, he would have been killed. Now, on just en route south of Turlock, reinforcements from Paris were approaching with ammunition and heavy weapons. Shimada's vanguard, led by Second Lieutenant Sadenobu Watanabe, who I'm sure you could not have found information on. Yeah, no, he's just a lieutenant.
I,
Yeah,
I raise my hands.
yeah. He was ambushed by approaching vehicles. The first two companies, approximately 250 men, were decimated. Watanabe, however, he pushed on. Near Slim River, Watanabe's tanks attacked a Gurkha's brigade. It was actually their headquarters area. And Captain Tom Mooney, instead of seeking cover, apparently he did this. This is another quote. He drew his .45 revolver, stood his ground, and fired upon the tanks until he was shot dead. It's a Hollywood moment, to be sure.
It doesn't it feel like General Maletti of the Italian Tenth Army when
Yeah,
Richard
it's actually,
O'Connor
yeah.
launched his attack?
Yeah, it's exactly like Milady.
He was, I think, at his tent in that fortress of where the Italians were camped, where the
Yeah, he was
Maletti
having
group was
breakfast.
camped.
They were all eating
Yeah, and then
breakfast at that time.
he runs out with the machine gun and gets machine gun.
Yep. Now, Watanabe's primary objective was to seize the Slim River Road Bridge. There he encountered another Gurkha force, many of whom were young recruits. Major Winkfield recalled this. It's a quote. True, the battle sounded a bit close, but we were miles behind the front, and there was no air about. The men behind were looking back and hurrying. They kept pressing forward. The next thing I knew, a machine gun blazed in my ear. A bullet grazed my leg and I dived into the ditch as a tank bore down on me. It had passed through half of my battalion without me realizing that anything was even amiss. To say the least, the death toll was quite high. Colonel Fulton was wounded and later he would die in captivity. Now, at his headquarters in Tanjong Malim, Archibald Paris was unaware of the rapid collapse of his brigades. 2 hours after the Japanese attack, intelligence ceased. Reports of enemy breakthroughs began to surface, though. Paris dispatched Lieutenant Colonel Arthur Harrison to investigate, and Harrison had this to recall. The next thing I knew was a deafening volley of machine gun bullets shattering my windscreen. I wrenched the wheel hard to starboard, crashed into the ditch, opened the door, leapt out, and ran like hell for over 50 yards of open ground to flimsy security of some scattered rubber. A man named Golem, who I think was his driver, showed up right behind him, holding a wounded shoulder, stating in bewilderment this quote, "Are those armored cars, Sahib?" Now, Watanabe was continuing his advance, where he killed Lieutenant Colonel Charles Home. So another man was present there. Watanabe then reached the bridge defended by Beaufort's gunners and a Hong Kong artillery unit. Their anti-tank guns using airburst ammunition were ineffective against T-95 armor. The gunners were all fled, and Watanabe began cutting the wires to the demolition charges that were being set up on the bridge. Watanabe was injured himself, but he remained on the bridge, while Ensign Tochiro Seto led troops with 3 tanks south of the river towards Tanjong Malim. Seto killed Colonel Augustus Murdoch there. A Japanese soldier at the scene later said this: Seto died in an officer-like manner, with his hand on the hilt of his service sword. Our old friend who's evil as hell, Tsuji, who was also present in many of these battles, witnessed the wreck, and he had this to say. Seto had collapsed beside his gun like a dish of ame. Now, Harrison said of the entire experience running from the tanks in his unpublished history of the 11th Division that he could not conceal his admiration for the men who almost killed him and his sidekick, Mustaf Ghulam, I think it was his driver. I can't remember. These are old notes I had. He has another quote to say. Heedless of the danger of their isolation, they had shattered through the division, and they had captured Slim Bridge by the recklessness and gallant determination. Now, aside from this battle that's raging on at Slim River, we have another event. Someone is arriving to Singapore.